Thank you very much to the Observer Research Foundation for inviting me to this event, and especially happy to be talking about this topic in a context, in a historical juncture when there are very serious emerging geopolitical crises around issues of trade, logistics, supply chains, and so on. Several speakers earlier have spoken about the long history of exchange, trade, and mobility between our two regions. And one must not forget that before the emergence of modern energy technologies, the weather and the climate played a very important role in this mobility. The monsoon winds enabled trade to take place between these two regions. Nature was, for many centuries, somewhat benign with our regions. The frequency and intensity of cyclones was much more on the eastern coast in the Bay of Bengal. But with climate change, it's beginning to change. And now nature seems to be making up with a vengeance, with a rapid increase in the frequency and intensity and number of cyclones and storms in this region. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, this is still some kind of a hubris about how we can deal with the climate crisis. So there's a medieval South Indian Tamil poet I'm quoting here who talks about how certain human beings tend to think that they are gods. And unfortunately, there are some human beings also who seem to think that technology can solve all our problems. So it is, of course, very important that we have trade, we have ports, the blue economy, oil, coastal transportation, special economic zones, and so on. But what we forget, and this comes out from several decades of research and scientific evidence, that many of these infrastructures are not quite resilient to challenges from climate hazards. And there is technology, engineering, scientific solutions for these. But also, emerging research shows that there is an interaction between anthropogenic activities, especially on the coast and in the sea, which enable these coastal climate hazards to affect human activities in very specific ways. And that kind of an assessment is as yet not done for a large number of projects, especially in this region that we are talking about. Next slide, please. The Arabian Sea countries, its littoral zones, the sea itself are undergoing a momentous process of transformation. So on the one hand, we have increased exposure to climate change risks and vulnerability, especially through sea level rise, storm surge, cyclones and storms, resulting in a series of disasters. On the other hand, as I was saying, there is also a rapid increase in urban expansion, infrastructure, real estate, ports, and so on. So these have been identified by the IPCC as leading to what are called as key risks as well as emerging risks for the future. And I have been part of a team at IIT Bombay, which has produced what is called a strategic knowledge on behalf of the National Mission on Strategic Knowledge for Climate Change of the Government of India. And it's somewhat disappointing that the very knowledge that the government is asking us to produce is not actively used by many government agencies and the private sector themselves. And this is something that the writer Amitav Ghosh refers to as the great derangement, where in spite of the scientific evidence and recognition of the risks that we have, we do not take them seriously in terms of how we address them. The next slide, please. So what exactly are the risks posed by climate change in the Arabian Sea region? Two key risks that are identified are sea level rise and changes in the frequency and intensity of extreme events. We tend to assume that climate change and sea level rise are distinct and discrete from anthropogenic activities. But human anthropogenic activities on land and the natural coastal processes, they do affect coastal hazards and how they impact human beings and human populations. Different regions of the Arabian Sea are at risk in many different ways, which are further exacerbated by human interventions. And these have human impacts, and very conservative estimates put them at billions of dollars of loss, including infrastructure damage, economic losses across the GCC countries and in India. Next slide, please. In the Arabian Sea region itself, climate events have become the new normal, as opposed to the frequency being more in the Bay of Bengal. There is an increase in the number, the frequency, the intensity, the accumulated cyclone energy, and the duration of Arabian Sea cyclones. And these range from 80% to 60% across these different kinds of variables. And there is clear link to global warming. And just in the modern period, in the last 200 years, there are 64 known storms in the modern period. And there's a definite acceleration after 2010 onwards. And these are reflected in flooding and various other kinds of risks that these countries are exposed to. And mega projects along the coast are further exacerbating the vulnerabilities of these populations. So there is a need for an urgent dialogue. Next slide, please. We have solid evidence that the frequency and intensity of cyclones in the Arabian Sea have increased. We have solid evidence to show that there is huge damage, losses, deaths. Media reports have also shown clear, have taken note of the scientific evidence for this, which have been affecting the GCC countries, especially Yemen, Iran, India, many of these countries. However, at the political and governance level, there is somewhat a tendency to be preoccupied with issues of attribution of these to climate change, to global warming, to be preoccupied with issues of prediction and so on. And there's very little focus, therefore, on adaptation and resilience. The future, keeping in mind the future risk scenarios that have been worked out, we need not just adaptation, now we need what the IPCC calls as pathways to transformation, a more holistic kind of change. Next slide, please. The impact of extreme events are already huge. The loss of life is not insignificant, and it is coming down with better preparedness. But property damage and economic losses run into billions of dollars. And they are only predicted to increase manifold if these extreme events return in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, as many studies show. Next slide, please. The IPCC Global 1.5 Degrees report and its application to India, they predict that for the Indian, they lay out very frightening scenarios, future risk scenarios for this region, especially for India. Of particular worry is that the gains that this region has achieved in terms of education, food security, energy security, mobility, all of these may be wiped out for especially those sections of the population dependent directly on agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and livestock, and so therefore they have significant impacts for food security. Just to give you one example of some scenarios that we worked out for the Indian coast, especially for the coast in Maharashtra, we also see an increasing occurrence of waterborne diseases, loss of biodiversity, and so on, which also have implications for food security, health, water quality, and so on. Next slide. So the emerging scenarios similarly have been worked out for Mumbai, and one of the things that I want to point out here is that it's not simply, like I was saying, the impact of climate change on cities, on dense populations, on economic growth centers, but also the nature of urbanization in these centers, how they themselves cause localized climate change impacts resulting in extreme precipitation events, heat island effects, and so on, which in turn require us to adapt in very unsustainable ways, including in terms of cooling solutions, air conditioning, and so on. And therefore, it's very important that at the regional level between the GCC and India, we are aware of these interconnections between different regions, between different urban zones, between different ecosystems, and what kind of an impact they are going to have at the micro level in terms of the microclimate, but also in terms of the larger ability to adapt and mitigate climate change without causing further damage. And just to keep repeating, because it's very important to underscore this fact that the economic costs are huge, because sometimes there tends to be a somewhat facetious argument about economic growth versus environment. We need both to address both together. Next slide. Several global and Indian reports have identified that cities like Mumbai and several other Asian cities are going to be at very high risk from climate change. They are among the top most 5 vulnerable cities to climate change hazards in the world. And there are similar studies for littoral, coastal, and marine zones in other parts of the Arabian Sea as well, which talk about how communities, economic sectors, environments are at extreme risk and finding it very difficult to cope and to be resilient in the context of increasing frequency and intensity of cyclones. Next slide. There are also significant issues for health, and this is where, especially after what we've gone through the pandemic, there is a need for greater cooperation because diseases tend to spread, and we are seeing with climate change how they affect vectors such as mosquitoes, and therefore diseases like H1N1, dengue, malaria, which were earlier under had some kind of control over them, tend to spread, and there's a greater need for regional cooperation without disturbing logistics and supply chains that happened during the pandemic. And that's something that we can initially try out at this regional level before we can think of global models. And of course, health impacts translate into adverse economic impacts as well. Just skip the next slide. Yeah, just skip this. Yeah. So the latest assessment report of the IPCC has included a new component which is called as response, that the way in which we as human beings, as governments, as markets respond to reducing vulnerability determines the long-term success in addressing future risk scenarios. And that is where these kinds of dialogues, these kinds of regional alliances become very important for us, because we are not just talking about responding to an external crisis from nature, we are talking about anthropogenic vulnerability, how we have caused this problem. And one of the aspects of this response... All right. I thought it was telling me to stop. All right. So, coming from the IPCC itself, but in several multinational projects that we are working on, this is the idea of pathways to transformation, and we are talking about alliances and networks, the role of alliances. If you can go to the next slide. So a couple of the projects that we are working on, one on transformation as praxis, which we have identified a desert area in India in Kutch, Sundarbans, which is the wetlands, and Mumbai, which is a city. And there's a second project called Oceans Pact, which again is a multi-country project. So there are emerging contestations and conflicts because of climate change, but also people being displaced from the ecosystems they depend on, the reduction. We've seen what happened with the Syrian crisis, which was also linked to the drought and not just the war, it was linked to climate change as well. So with different kinds of conflicts happening, we think of conflict not as something that is bad, but as an opportunity for us to transform the way in which we are doing things. And so in both of these projects, we're using the word transformation to sustainability through forming different kinds of alliances and networks. And if you can go to the last slide there. So we're talking about hybrid alliances that are not just between governments, but between government agencies, NGOs, civil society, environmental activists, the market, of course, playing a very important role here. And thinking about alternative socially just pathways, and the co-production of knowledge, which is where alliances such as these become very important, because it's not just knowledge produced by a particular agency or a particular country, but coming together to address these global challenges. So Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on what are called as the common property resources, uses this term nested enterprises. So in addressing climate change in the Arabian Sea area, if we can have multiple dialogues starting from the lowest level of a village in a coastal zone, for example, and working our way upwards through districts, states, countries, and the entire region. So it's like a Russian doll, nested enterprises within at higher levels and scales. So building up that kind of a dialogue will enable us to understand what are the challenges faced by communities, groups, economic sectors at different levels, while also enabling a dialogue and providing the power of markets, technologies, and governments to produce knowledge, to produce solutions to address it at multiple levels. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. A tough spot to be in. I think the twilight zone, both figuratively and topic-wise, climate change and climate financing, right? A wonderful set of experts here, and I just want to set the context and quickly get into the topic and lay out some provocative hypotheses. One, I want to talk about, we heard about food security and energy security in the morning, and how come climate finance security doesn't feature in, if you're so concerned about climate change and climate issues, climate financing doesn't come at all. India, for example, is going to need about $15 trillion in its journey for net zero 2070. And we were barely able to raise $18 billion in the last 3 years. And I'm not talking about the private sector investment into the startups or any of those. So we have a challenge because the conventional banking system and the traditional lenders are still not sure how to finance climate change. And that's a challenge we have globally, not just in India. The other one is the transition. When we speak about green, who defines green? Is it the Western concept of green? Because the green taxonomy itself is so fuzzy. If you have not read ORF's green taxonomy study, you must. It's a wonderful compilation. And yet, countries don't agree necessarily on green taxonomy. There are various models available. So repeatedly, if you look at the broken promises of funding the developing nations by the Western world, nothing has happened in the last so many years. And every COP, we'll probably get to the next COP number as well, and who's going to mind the COPs? And that's a big challenge. So 3 questions I want to ask the panelists to address. And before that, I want to also provocatively ask, saying if connect, create, collaborate is for this conference, should climate change be all about climate, capital, and crisis? We have both a climate crisis as well as a capital crisis. How do we sort that? Where is the capital for climate finance going to come from? That's the first point I would like you to address. And what are the ideas for climate finance that necessarily does not break the back of our financial stability? That we don't have to sell our soul to the investors. How do we manage that? And the third one is a dialogue like this, an Arabian Sea Dialogue. Can we look at ideas like how EU came up, European Union? If you're saying that that is the one, can we look at a GIC model, a Gulf India cooperation or a commons? And would it help in the climate conversation at all? Let's go first to the first panelist. Walid, please.
Thank you. Well, finance is finance. Financial instruments are there. If we use them to finance the green transition or the blue one, call it what you want, we are talking about green finance or climate finance. We are talking about the same financial instruments, bonds, sukuk, swaps, PPP, and so on. The fact is, according to the UN, we will need around $1.5 trillion per year to meet the climate change targets compatible with SDGs targets. And when we know that we cannot count on the developed countries to finance this, we, developing countries, should work on scaling up these green finance or climate finance instruments. Now it's a bit complex for a lot of our countries to implement these financial instruments. So responsibilities lies with the governments, including the central banks, with the financial and the financial systems, including the banks, and finally the investors, because we need a shift in their behavior. First of all, we need the governments to set an enabling environment, including regulations, the governance, the policies, and also very important to guarantee the financial and economic stability. Then we need the financial system and the banks, especially to empower themselves and to develop the capacity to assess the new risks discount these risks and to learn how to issue these new financial instruments and how to manage them, to make them attractive to the investors. This is, in few words, what are we about? So, I see this session as a continuation of the session about trade and investment, of course, because we are talking about the same thing. Now we have to choose in this green or blue transition the projects that make it or to meet the climate transition targets and compatible again with the SDGs targets. And hand in hand with the private sector. In the middle, we need this financial system to upgrade and to make it happen. According to a recent report released by the Mohammed bin Rashid government school, they said a lot of these green financial instruments are not there yet in the GCC countries. They represent a good opportunities. Few countries, mainly Saudi Arabia and UAE and Bahrain to a lesser extent, use sukuk and bonds, and that's it. So this is the opportunity is there, and we need to. It is an urgency to scale up our capability to channel investments, capital to finance the green projects.
Thank you. Paul, if I can ask you to interject, apart from this, as you've seen as a banker, the tendency to green shame versus green wash. And as we go along this climate finance journey, what are the struggles and challenges that you anticipate?
Well, I think one of the first things is admitting that the problem is huge. And we are, in a rather precarious situation. So it's not so hunky-dory as we, sometimes wish it to be. Having said that, I think, funding sources, how do you mitigate the problem in a financial context? The big picture is there has to be a multilateral play here. There has to be a huge shift in how we look at our own budgets and where the priorities in terms of the allocations lie. There will have to be fundamental shifts. The whole philosophy of, subsidies and things like that, will we pull that back and redirect them? Sometimes some of those will be actually enhanced because the destabilization that will come in society will require empathetic contribution from government, and so further budgetary outlays. So this is a huge challenge. The banking system is there. The, other institutional structures are there, like pension funds and things like that. You have, sovereign funds. Everyone will have a role to play because the quantum requirement is simply humongous. And so I don't think you have to, look at where will it come from. It has to come from everywhere. That's a simple answer.
Sure. Prachi, you're a founder and you play a role in this sector. What are some of the interesting challenges you have faced, especially when it comes to financing? And how serious is this topic? Do people, is it fashionable to talk about climate change and climate financing, or is it really there that people take it seriously?
Okay, that's a great question. But first of all, I want to talk about how honored I am to be sitting with all of you here today, because I'm probably the youngest person on the panel, if not in the room. I see a couple of young people there as organizers. But I've learned a lot from all of you, especially about the macro aspects of green financing and climate financing. I want to, from my own experience, speak a little bit about the micro aspect. What does climate financing look like in our own homes? So 4 years ago, as a young student, I asked myself a question: what can an ordinary girl like me do about a big problem like climate change? I started building an app to help people like you and I reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions to a target. And I decided that a major part of my career is going to be dedicated to helping the world solve climate change. Now, my grandmother had a few words to say about this. She asked me a very pointed question that took me aback. And over the years, time and again, frantic parents have asked me the same question when their children have decided to take climate change as a serious career choice. It's the same question that you also asked me this afternoon when we interacted. Any guesses as to what that question could be? Absolutely right, sir. So over and over again, parents have asked me, and my grandmother asked me that day, how are you going to earn money from this? She thought I was spoiling away a bright career and a bright future that I had ahead of me. And every time she'd speak to her friends, she'd say, I don't know what my granddaughter is doing. She's doing something related to the environment. Now, it's been 4 years since then. The app that I had started building as a student has grown into a global enterprise. Today, we have over 30,000 citizens from 110 countries coming on the platform. We've worked with some of the biggest organizations to help them take climate action. And most importantly, today, my grandmother tells everybody she meets about how proud she is of the thriving career ahead of me in climate. So why am I talking about this? I think climate change is the biggest problem in front of us today. And over the last few generations, we saw the top minds in the world taking career choices like medicine, engineering, all noble professions. But now, to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need the brightest minds in the world, the brightest students, to take climate change as a thriving and a lucrative career choice. We need parents to dream of their child becoming a climate innovator. And when we achieve that, that to me is what real climate financing would look like. And I think that is what we want to achieve. We want to make this fashionable. That has been my ground experience. But I also want to look at what are the global targets we have ahead of us for climate financing. In COP16, we put a target that developing countries are going to put $100 billion every year into developing nations in climate financing. And we had decided to do it every single year till 2020. Did we achieve that? What do you think? Did we do it? No. So we didn't do it, but we did realize the importance of this. So in COP21, this goal was again reiterated till the year 2025. So why couldn't we do it the first time around? I believe it's because any huge transformation requires grassroots citizen level participation. Let me give an example of what that might look like. So when I decided that I wanted to have a career in climate change, I spent some months on ground looking at how climate change is actually impacting the day-to-day lives of people. So I traveled with farmers across Maharashtra, a group farming initiative which was tackling climate change by adopting to climate-resilient greenhouse agriculture. And over there, I met a farmer who wanted to build a solar panel on top of his greenhouse. He had a huge vision for this because the solar panel was not only going to meet the energy requirement of his greenhouse, but it was also going to generate enough electricity to power 30 Indian homes. Now he had the vision, he had the space. There are even some government schemes to incentivize farmers to take up solar farms in that space. But he still couldn't do it. Why? Because he didn't have the money. He didn't have the capital intensiveness required to switch to renewable energy. Now imagine a citizen living in Dubai whose annual income is going to be 10 to 20 times that of an average Indian citizen, and so are his greenhouse gas emissions. He wants to switch to renewable energy, but he doesn't know how, and he doesn't have enough space on his rooftop to put up a solar panel. Can he finance that farmer in India to put up a solar panel on his farm, which will not only make his home climate neutral, but also save up his electricity bill for the next 10 to 20 years? Now, this kind of citizen-led climate financing, I believe, is what going to take this whole thing to the next level. And it may seem like a pipe dream, but it's not unheard of. Countries like UK, Japan are already setting up inter-country virtual net metering connected grids. India has a very visionary initiative, One Sun, One Grid, One World. It envisions a world which is interconnected by one solar grid. I believe we must start this discussion today, not just to talk about how the GCC countries and India can come together to create a partnership for climate financing, but we also must talk about how the citizens of our countries can come together to finance climate action in their own homes. And that is my perspective on climate financing as somebody who's actually been working as a climate entrepreneur.
Thank you, Prachi. So let me bring in Shamika here. I mean, we'll move from micro to structural changes and large-scale policy initiatives. India has, let's say, shown a lot of impetus this arena, and we've also have the One Solar Alliance and so on and so forth. What is it that we could do with GCC, and what are the early learnings, the teething troubles and challenges that we have learned or figured out?
Well, one thing is, and everyone on the panel talked about how important it is, how fashionable it has to become. There is no escape. I think the science is very clear, and yet we have to worry because just the way ESG started with a great deal of fanfare, and there is a considerable disenchantment today, particularly in the US, not as much in Europe yet, but definitely the US, and that is a worrisome sign because that E of ESG stood for environment. So we were meant to experiment and come up with better instruments and initiatives which were supposed to respond to this, but it's been over a decade, and there is an unraveling of that, experiment. But I think this is where the leadership matters, and one thing is very clear that at $2,200 per capita per annum, we are a low middle income country. We have to grow a lot. Growth is absolutely non-negotiable, right? Which means we are going to pollute a lot. So while India is, and now we're not talking per capita and the justice aspect of it, we will continue to grow, that's a given, which means we will pollute. India definitely wants to and has already shown the commitment in terms of reduction in emissions, etc. We want to be a very significant part of the solution. That leadership initiative has already happened. Therefore, the conversation around the saffron revolution, which means moving towards renewable. And I'm really glad when Prachi said it has to become citizen-led. Now, an excellent example here is, remember, green revolution, the technology was brought in 45, 50 years back, but it did not become a mass movement until every farmer adopted the high-yielding variety, adopted the technology with the risks associated, etc. That's exactly the kind of mass movement which is being attempted in India today, as far as energy security is concerned. So the concern is that we have to move away from thermal and coal towards renewable. But the financing part of it is probably the biggest hurdle for us. While there is a growing appetite and there is definitely a leadership, so unlike the OECD countries where climate denial is still very much a significant problem, for us that is not a problem. So I think there is a buy-in from not just the leadership but from people at large, right? The problem is, where will the capital come from? Now, we have seen pledges, whether it was from Germany of 10 billion euros earlier in the year. We are seeing commitments also from the Middle East. The issue is we need to go beyond now talking this 36,000 level conversation. We have to get down to what are the instruments going to be? What is the actual deployment going to be? And on that count, let me tell you that the innovations in India, they are happening at the state level. I think this is what many such gatherings and many research which still look at India as one big market are missing a lot of the innovation that the state governments are undertaking. So you have to look at Karnataka government, you have to look at a relatively poor, one of our poorest states is Madhya Pradesh. And one initiative which has been undertaken is every district is mapping its biodiversity. They know that this GDP game is very difficult for them to catch up, particularly in terms of setting up special economic zones or thinking of manufacturing-led growth, etc. For them, it is going to be a very difficult catch-up game. So they want to, very rightfully, I think the thought process is absolutely bang on, we want to put a value to biodiversity, which means now we are going to be able to measure district by district, and MP becomes a proof of concept, therefore, that we can then trade in carbon because we have to pay for that biodiversity to remain. This is an idea which has already begun to take root. I know a similar conversation is happening in Meghalaya as well. So initiatives are happening at the local level. There is a great buy-in. I think leadership within India, again, political entrepreneurship on that count, not a problem. I think the biggest failing right now is on count of global financial institutions such as the World Bank. Why are they missing from this conversation? Their job is to be able to take care of the first order risk when it comes to financial deployment of these kind of problems. So we have to actually expect more from institutions such as the World Bank.
Sure, thank you. Let me bring in Labas for your views on what you think and where do you think the collaboration lies?
To understand where the GCC-India collaboration lies, we have to look in a wide manner to climate finance and broaden it to sustainability finance, not only climate finance. Why? The reason, because now there is sustainability risk. Because of the sustainability risk, investors need to shift their investment in order to avoid this risk that is associated with activities that hurt the earth and that pollute the earth and that are not sustainable. GCC countries, all of them, they have funds, investment funds abroad, and large investment funds. And probably, I don't have exact figure how the fund is distributed between sustainable activities and non-sustainable activities, but I assume that non-sustainability activity and non-sustainable financial assets is the dominant. So they need to shift. They need to look at their investment strategies and make the shift in order to avoid this risk. This is the principle. Now, countries like India, they need to invest in a sustainable activity, most given also climate finance and other green financial instruments. This is open an opportunity for the GCC countries to move to shift their investment portfolios in order to increase their sustainability finance, and to avoid this risk. The latest UNCTAD report, International Investment Report, says the sustainability finance, it's more than $5 trillion, and it's an increase of 63% between 2020 and 2021. The problem with this investment is self-declared. It's the investors who said, my investment is in this area is sustainable or not. So I assume it's a little bit exaggerated because of the data quality, because of the audit, lack of audit, and lack of scrutiny over this investment, and because as well fund owners, they don't disclose. Mainly, they lack a lot of transparency. So, but the guiding principle for increasing cooperation will come from this branch of capital owners need to look at their investment and change it from non-sustainable activity to sustainable activity, because non-sustainable activities will lead eventually medium to long run to a decline of the return. Given India high growth rate and low population rate means that India is in a good path of development. It's a good news for investors. But as one of the questions in the morning says, why we don't invest in capital in India? I don't find a valuable economic excuse for this. Given mature markets, the return is less than emerging markets. Probably because due to risk assessment, or probably because they are comfortable investing in mature markets. We need to know what are the real reasons why GCC don't invest in portfolio in India, why they only concentrate only on FDI. And FDI is a small part because it's small part of the funds, because when we say, for example, one country has 500 billion in a sovereign fund, means that the opportunities are there. If the return is higher, then I assume it's higher in any emerging country than any mature countries, because data show that. So probably in terms of policy in India to be more aggressive to attract funds. Because if we leave it to the markets only and to the assessment, probably the trend will continue. Policy needed to bring the incentive to make investors think twice. Why investors couldn't make systematic errors in investment. If the gap of the return is high, the investor should move his money, of course, by assessing the risk. Probably the problem is here. Lack of strategy. We don't push enough. We don't persuade enough our partners to come and invest in portfolio in India. Not only in portfolio, as well, there are other instruments apart from FDI. There are green bonds, there are stock markets, there are PPP projects, and all these instruments, because the definition of green finance or sustainable, it's only traditional investment financial instruments when they are used in a sustainable manner become green. And it is also not clear how green are they because of the discussion, because when you invest, for example, in electric cars and you use electricity non-sustainable, it is not green. They call it gray or whatever the color. So I think this is the route to increase cooperation between two in this green finance area.
Thank you. So I want to ask a question to Paul. Now coming to, let's say, from the banking system or the lending system point of view, there are various instruments that have been around for quite some time. Is there a confusion about how to assess impact, or is it about outcomes that the industry is worried about?
Well, I think if you ask about capacity, it's one of the things I've been discussing. There's a huge amount of capacity that's required simply at the operating level. So if a relationship manager is going to get a new account or originate a new business, he's not too particularly concerned about applying the necessary filters from a climate risk perspective, right? He's just about getting business. Then the risk chain, then the audit chain. I don't think those capacities exist today. In India and in the GCC, we will have to cope with similar problems. For example, we have coal and thermal. The Middle East is, fossil fuel. Both have to at some point transition out. So you've got at policy level to figure out grand percentages, to some extent. What do we dissuade? What do we transition sensibly from an investment protection perspective? And what is it that you encourage? And then on the ones that you want to encourage, you need to provide, in the early days at least, the capacity to take that risk. So somebody has to join in the risk-taking process and in the returns process. So there are sovereign funds, there's government, those reallocation processes have to happen. In the banking sector, I feel the greater worry in banking sector, and we've also talked about insurance in this context, where collective action starts to happen. where you say one sector will not get reinsured because the perceived risks are so high. Or you say a particular geography, and we keep talking about, for example, in Uttarakhand, there's a program to, keep increasing the number of dams that are built, but they're, to my mind, unsustainable. And therefore, at some point, someone's going to say, when anything happens in that state, I'm not going to support it. And that's the kind of action that might be required if governments or policymakers don't take it in time. The market will penalize, because I don't want to put money there and have it all, go down the tube. But still, I think it's early days within the financial services system to be able to make the assessment, to calculate the impact, to value the resources. We even today don't have templates, proper templates, because data itself is sketchy. And I don't think it's too different for most of the GCC. So we'll cope with the similar problems of having the same or similar risks of transition, the similar risk of lack of capacity to make the choices and decisions, and therefore the support that is required will be both at the government level, at the intergovernment level in terms of funding flows, and also taking calls on saying this no more, this get out of it in say 10 years, and this encourage very aggressively today. And both groups will have to do that.
Sure. So I want to pick Shamika on data governance. There is a worry
Actually,
that
before you ask that question, because I'll forget that, I'm sorry. Actually, benchmarks exist. In fact, there are global benchmarks. Because remember, impact investing as a field has matured a great deal. The problem is the risk assessment and the financial returns part of it is faring very well. In fact, in India, there is an Impact Investors Council out of Mumbai, and we have more than 50 firms which are registered as impact investors. The problem always happens on the impact, not the financial bit, but the social or whatever this other impact, right? It started out with ESG, but now when we're saying green, now what is the social impact? And that is where it's a big problem, because I think the firms also, while they believe they're doing wonderful work, they're not terribly open to being evaluated, right? And this is where we are saying we want the Quality Council of India, just like we have grading of qualities, etc. I think that amount of information has to be made public. We should be able to assess. In fact, in impact bonds, and we've had a couple of very successful experiments with impact bonds in Rajasthan and now in UP, where the impact has to be measured by a third party. So I think those, again, I highly recommend that you read this report called The Promise of Impact Investing in India. It has a survey of impact investments. And in fact, agriculture is doing very well. Health is doing. These are mostly portfolios that are giving you above market returns. So again, profitability, very good. The social impact, nobody wants to know. And that is where the problem is. And we have to make a regulation. Now, India might be one of the very few countries which has a social stock exchange. We just created it a couple of months back after deliberations of about 3 years. I was part of that committee. The whole idea is to be able to channel capital towards impactful sectors, right? And be able to create the kind of things that Paul was talking about. Regulation, creating enough capacity, not just within the industry, but also government to understand and sort of channel. Sorry, your question.
So the question was on data governance. There's also worry saying that are we end up doing double counting and triple counting of either on impact or outcomes? I'm not talking about financial metric at all here. I mean, on the sheer impact. There's a worry that there are too many promises and you double count because you're working across layers of governments, the central government, the state government, the local government, or on the field. And if everybody keeps on adding statistics and finally the Excel sheets lands up at your desk, it's probably padded up 3x. And that's a worry that we've always had because there is no common data standard that governments use. If you look at our own regulators, each of them uses a different data format. And for the first time, we are finally getting our regulators speaking about XBRL or something as a data standard. So is there a need for a data standard for climate financing? Because then it builds trust. To Laba's point about how do we trust, then data has to be God. But today we have made data as an Excel sheet.
No, absolutely. What you're saying is bang on. But I'll tell you, we have a problem which might be even more primitive. Data could still be a fixable problem. Many times we have a policy, for instance, on metering. Right? Suppose households have solar panels in net, they could actually be earning from the grid if they're not consuming all the electricity that is being generated from the solar. Now, different states have to come up with policies on how that net metering will be done. A state like Karnataka has been absolutely open and quite successful, in many ways. But in UP, while it's a great sounding policy, recommended by the central government, in UP it is proving very difficult because the DISCOMs are resisting it. So, there are policies. I think it is not now the lack of awareness of a lot of these things, but at the regulatory level, India being very large federal country, and a lot of these policies are local level policies, it'll require a certain degree of drive, some degree of naming, shaming, which Niti Aayog has done now for about 10 years in creating indices and saying these states are particularly susceptible and good, let's say, good at performing on these metrics. I think we need to do similar assessment, what we have done for ease of doing business or investment friendliness, etc. We need to do that for green finance as well, because regulation still does remain a big impediment. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we'll throw it open to the audience. Any questions? Well, there's a written test after we leave.
We have to applaud their...
I think I just want to add one thing. Between GCC and India, one of the things that we will both have are the challenges of transition. And I think we need to work on that together. We may be coming from different starting blocks,
correct,
but the process has to be common and understood. The second is, I think, in terms of sovereign funds and the capacities to invest, what Mr. Laba said was absolutely spot on. I think the composition of the portfolios has to change towards some of these things. And where required, the consistency of returns must be ensured at government level. So if RDR is investing 50% of its portfolio in sustainable projects, and the other 50% is giving them an X yield, and this is giving X minus, that minus may be something that, so future budgets would have to probably build in this as one of the elements of ensuring financial sustainability.
So I think apart from fiscal deficit, add to returns deficit.
No, the whole thing, the fiscal deficit has to be pulled back. I mean, that's the whole point, So some of those allocations, the nature of priority has to change.
Yeah. Any questions?
I actually have a question to ask the audience. So suppose your home can become carbon neutral, but you have to spend 20% of your income in trying to do that. How many of you would take that deal? If you can give me a show of hand. You can become carbon neutral, but you have to spend 20% of your income.
As capex?
Yeah.
One-time capex?
No, every month.
Every month.
How many are going to do it?
I would rather be a teenage kid and get free pocket money. This is too expensive.
So no hands. Okay, one.
Can I answer? I think there is a word of caution, really.
Yes.
That it's not this way or the other.
Right.
And there's a role for governments in
Right.
terms of regulating and so on. We can't just leave it to the free market to dictate. Otherwise, there's no need for us to talk, there's no need for government to think, no regulation,
Absolutely.
nothing. And they will do it. I mean, the markets are working and they're choosing where to invest their money.
Right.
We need something different. We tried that model. That model is what led us to where we are today, including the
Absolutely.
crisis in Europe, before that was Latin America and the United States. It just goes from one part to the other. And the opportunity we have here, as we said earlier in the morning, is to think of something fresh from the region that's not totally free. We're not saying we want just to encourage businesses and investment funds to invest more and more money and to deregulate and deregulate and deregulate. We're saying we need to balance, and we need to balance it based on relation that we expect man to man or man to woman, man, and man to nature that has not been taken into consideration in the past.
I agree with you entirely. You know, a lot of, in India, for example, if you actually look at CO2 emission growth rates, in China is 300%, India is close second at 200%, of different absolute levels. Having said that, we are always going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, juxtaposing the socio argument versus the environment argument constantly. And governments have that challenge that, this project means I'm taking away something from somewhere. So I think the shift has to happen at the mindset, even at the political level. But without government making some of these choices in terms of broad allocations, there is very little chance of success anyway. So you're absolutely right. Governments have to be very much part of the process.
Can I elaborate on the first question? I think she's given us a hard choice of losing 20% per month. I think it should be sold better than that, with the social impact. It should be sold, what's in it for me? And then again, we come back to not only regulation, but also from the beginning. How was I raised from school? Was I prepared to give up 20% of my income for a good global social cause? It's not even, it's a survival mechanism, long-term survival mechanism. So I think if we were to ask people to embrace it, we would need to sell it better.
So, sir, then based on that, my follow-up question is, if we end up saving 10% of our income, how many of us would do it then? If we save 10% by becoming carbon neutral? We'll all, yes, we'll all do it, right? So then I want to talk about how do we finance individual climate action? There are funds available for climate innovation, climate entrepreneurship. But I remember when I had just started Cool the Globe app, and I got a call from a 6th grader from a village called Solapur. And he said, I had taken all the actions that you had suggested in the app. I've saved 60 kg of CO2 emissions. By doing that, I've started cycling to my school instead of going by car. Now, what do I get after this? Are you going to give me money? What are you going to give me? And so when we were building the app, we were thinking that for any kind of behavioral change, you need two things. You need to quantify that behavior, and you need to reward that behavior. And so then I think the follow-up question in front of us is, how do we reward individual citizens to make climate action a part of their life in a way that they're not just doing it for the environment, but also for larger goals that align with their life?
Thank you. I think with that, sorry, you have a question.
No, thanks for taking this one. So we've heard a lot, and pardon my ignorance, I'm a total carbon green thumb, if I can call it like that. But I've heard a lot about how banks can finance, how institutions can actually go in and fund. But pretty much that's all that we've heard. As an individual, I hear governments talking about an X thing, and funding must come for here and stuff. But for any movement, and this is just me as a layman speaking, for any movement to sort of really get there, it's not just the government or just funds, right? It's also education at the grassroots. It's also media. It's also behavior. It's also rewards. It's also individual. Now, what I see missing in this entire green ecosystem, if I can call it that, is who's coordinating that? Is there a body that is actually even moving towards that direction? Or is everybody just running after, hey, I need to get the government to say X, or I need to get Y amount of funds? But where is the media? Where is that education? Where is the lobbying happening that, hey, in schools we should actually be teaching about climate change? And not just climate change, but how to be better climate citizens or carbon neutral citizens, if I can. That's really the big question that I have in my mind. I'm sure that funds can still be made available, right? I mean, if you go to, if the Indian government were to say that, hey, I'll help you save 10% of your income, or I won't tax you 10%, just put it towards the thing, everybody say, yeah, let's do it. But is that the real answer? Because we all know what's going to happen to those funds. They may or may not necessarily make it to the right place. And where is it that coordination is happening? And I personally find that missing. This is just a comment from my side, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So, well, in 45 minutes we try to speak. Let me just assure you that in about a year's time, the whole idea of that Niti Aayog behavioral change compendium that I mentioned in the morning was about picking up these kind of initiatives, right? And what I'm writing about in that compendium is gamification. You see, in Delhi, our children, we burst a lot of crackers, so I must say we plead guilty. But our children don't touch crackers, and mostly because the schools educated them that firecrackers are the worst thing you can do for your asthma. Children are extremely important instruments of policy change and the education system, therefore. And one of the biggest sources of change is happening through innovations in the gaming space. In fact, climate is a very small part of it, but there are many other activities which are being initiated through gaming. So it's like you wake up in the morning, you switch off your lighting, 10 points. And then you use less water, ting, ting, 5 points. So it's a way of rewarding them. Now, at the end, we'll have to figure out what reward is. But just like in games, the stars are all they might be working towards. But I think it's a very powerful instrument.
So I think literacy, if you see the literacy around sustainability, green, it's caught on. I mean, it's actually, Shamika's right. I mean, it's the school kids who actually teach us. I mean, we have to thank our teachers for passing this knowledge. I remember I picked up a lesson from my younger one who actually asked me this question saying that you speak about green, but you fly, how many flights do you take a year? And it kind of got me thinking. So figured out an app and calculated the carbon miles. And then she said, why are we having plastic bottles? Every time we go out, we buy plastic water bottles. And it struck a chord when I walked into a boardroom and I said, why is it that in a boardroom of a large enterprise which speaks about sustainability, you have fantastic plastic bottles? And when you ask this question, everybody blames whom? The CEO doesn't take the responsibility. CEO blames the peon or the admin guy. Why did you get this? I mean, the behavior has to start from the top. So some of these are hard conversations. While we want to point fingers at everybody, we don't want to look inward or at ourselves. I mean, what do we do? How do we do? And I think literacy, school literacy around this topic is picked up a couple of years and it's far more powerful. I think it's us in the corporate world who are a little thick-skinned because it works for me, it's okay, I don't want to talk about it, and that's where we leave there. Sorry.
There is a reason why the global UNICEF behavioral change, social behavior, communication and change is in India. They obviously see the potential. They've chosen India for the headquarters of their SBCC, Social Behavior, Communication and Change, because I think they see the potential impact it can make if you have positive social change in India. And I think the green wave can do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being wonderful panelists. Thank you so much.